Welcome to Daily Review, your daily dose of literary exploration. We dive into books that spark curiosity and ignite growth. While our passion often leads us to nonfiction reads that empower and improve your life, no book is off limits.
That's right.
From gripping thrillers to insightful memoirs and compelling fiction to historical accounts, we're here to share and discuss all the interesting reads we cover. Today, we're going to unpack a topic that touches every single one of us, work.
Yeah, it really does.
It's a concept so ingrained in our lives, we rarely stop to think about its origins or how profoundly its meaning has changed over millennia.
It's truly eye-opening, isn't it? When you consider how many of our modern anxieties about automation maybe, or even just finding purpose in our jobs, they're actually deep echoes of these fundamental questions humans have been wrestling with since, practically forever.
Right.
This deep dive into James Suzman's work, A Deep History from the Stone Age to the Age of Robots, it offers us this truly sweeping, almost cosmic perspective on this universal human experience.
That's absolutely right. Yeah. And our mission today is really to explore that winding, often quite surprising journey of work.
Yeah.
And I mean, not just the physical actions we perform, but how we've even thought about it, understood it, and how it's become part of our very identity. We'll trace its evolution from, ancient hunter-gatherers living lives most of us can barely even imagine, all the way up to our current age of artificial intelligence.
It's a huge span.
It is. And along the way, we're going to challenge some of our most fundamental assumptions. Things about scarcity, about purpose, even about what it really means to be human.
Absolutely.
By the time we're done, you might just look at your own workday completely differently. Okay, let's really dig into this then. Many of us today feel, perpetually trapped maybe.
Yeah.
In these endless work cycles, always striving for more, often feeling this deep sense of obligation to our jobs.
Right, the daily grind.
Exactly. But what's fascinating is that the book reminds us it wasn't always seen this way. Actually, quite the opposite. There was this surprising historical optimism, almost a utopian dream about the liberating potential of automation. Yeah, looking forward to machines doing the hard stuff. Precisely. Thinkers like Adam Smith, often seen as the founding father of modern economics, writing way back in 1776 in The Wealth of Nations, he wasn't just talking about pin factories. No. He actually expressed admiration for what he called very pretty machines that he genuinely believed would facilitate and abridge labor. He saw technology as a way to free people from drudgery.
Interesting he used the word pretty.
Isn't it? Then fast forward about a century, and you've got Oscar Wilde, with his usual wit and foresight, fantasizing about a future in which machinery will be doing all the necessary and unpleasant work, leaving humanity free for beauty and intellectual pursuits.
The Wildean dream. But maybe the most comprehensive, certainly the most widely cited prediction like this came from the economist John Maynard Keynes.
Keynes, yeah.
Right. In his really influential 1930 essay, Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, Keynes painted this truly utopian picture. He predicted that by the early 21st century, which is, now,
right here,
thanks to relentless technological advances and exponential capital growth, humanity would reach an economic promised land.
Wow.
And in this future, he envisioned everyone's basic material needs being so easily satisfied that nobody would need to work more than, get this, 15 hours a week.
15 hours, that sounds amazing.
It was a bold claim, a vision of widespread leisure. But this brings up a critical question, and it's really one of the central paradoxes the book explores.
Which is?
We passed Keynes' thresholds for productivity and capital growth decades ago.
We did, okay.
Yeah. Yet the reality is most of us still work just as hard, maybe even harder than our grandparents did. Governments everywhere are still fixated on perpetual economic growth, the relentless creation of new jobs.
Even when it seems counterintuitive.
Exactly. Even when technology should be freeing us up, we're even expected to extend our working lives, often nearly a decade longer than previous generations. So this profound disconnect between the potential and the reality, it hints at a deeper underlying economic problem and our pervasive anxiety about automation.
And that anxiety isn't just theoretical.
Oh, not at all. It's immediate for hundreds of millions of unemployed people in developing countries where tech and capital often don't create enough jobs to lift people out of poverty.
Right.
It also hits semi-skilled workers hard in industrialized economies whose jobs are increasingly vulnerable to automated systems that, don't strike, don't ask for raises, don't get sick.
It's moving up the chain now too, right?
That's the surprising part. It's reaching highly skilled professions. We've got AI systems now that can design better AI than human engineers can. So it seems our own ingenuity is, in this profound and kind of ironic way, turning our workplaces into what the book calls these metaphorical devil's workshops that threaten to leave our hands idle and maybe even rob our lives of purpose.
So if you're listening to this, you might be asking yourself, why do we as a species feel so, I don't know, genetically hardwired maybe to work, to fill every moment with activity, even when automation keeps dangling this tantalizing prospect of leisure in front of us?
It's a huge question.
It really is a profound, almost existential question that deeply shapes our modern anxieties and, frankly, our whole societal structure.
And underlying these pervasive anxieties, particularly in, say, industrialized societies, is this really deeply ingrained conviction that humanity is somehow cursed by desires we can never truly satisfy.
The scarcity mindset.
Exactly, this perpetual state of inherent scarcity. The assumption is that evolution has basically molded us into inherently selfish, endlessly striving creatures, forever burdened by these insatiable wants for resources and status.
It's almost taken as a given, isn't it?
It really is.
But what if that's not universally true? What if that fundamental assumption about scarcity isn't some natural law of human existence?
Now you're getting to the core of Suzman's argument.
The book introduces us to the hoansi, often referred to in older texts as Bushmen, from southern Africa's Kalahari Desert. They lived as hunter-gatherers well into the late 20th century, offering this kind of living window into a totally different way of being.
Amazing.
And for them, the whole concept of a market economy, which is, predicated on eternal scarcity and the endless pursuit of accumulation, was utterly bewildering. They just couldn't wrap their heads around it. Didn't compute at all. And other hunter-gatherer societies, like the Hadzabe in East Africa or the Inuit up in the Arctic, they similarly struggled to make sense of and adapt to the norms of an economic system that just saw scarcity as this eternal, inescapable truth.
Their reality was often quite different.
It seemed to be one of sufficiency, not perpetual lack.
So if we connect this to the broader tapestry of human history, it really suggests something radical, that the problem of scarcity might not be an inherent human condition, universally molded by evolution into selfish, competitive creatures,
but
rather a profound assumption, an idea that emerged and became dominant with certain societal structures, most notably with the arrival of agriculture.
Wow. Okay, so scarcity is maybe cultural, not biological.
That's the provocative idea. It's a really radical concept for many in the industrialized world, where scarcity is often just presented as this immutable law of nature, like gravity.
Yeah.
It challenges the very foundation of a lot of our economic thought. It suggests that maybe our current economic problem and our relentless drive to work isn't some natural inevitability, but maybe a powerful, culturally constructed story we tell ourselves.
Okay, here's where the book takes a really fascinating turn, moving beyond just human perception or even biology, and dives right into physics to explain life itself as a form of work.
Yeah, this part is mind-bending.
It starts with the Austrian physicist Ludwig Boltzmann. A pioneer in statistical mechanics, hugely admired Darwin's work and saw entropy's hand not just in the universe, but profoundly shaping evolution.
Entropy, that's the tendency towards disorder, right?
Exactly. Things naturally fall apart, rust, decay.
Mm-hmm.
But then Erwin Schrödinger, the Nobel Prize winner, famous for his thought experiment with the imaginary cat.
Schrödinger's cat, yeah.
He pushed this idea further. He argued that living organisms, from the tiniest bacterium to the biggest whale, are essentially thermodynamic engines that appear to defy this second law of thermodynamics, the universal drift towards disorder.
How do they do that?
By precisely organizing atoms into incredibly complex, ordered structures, things like hair or livers or even the intricate neural networks that let us think and perceive. They create order locally.
But what's truly illuminating here is Schrödinger's deeper insight. Life couldn't exist in violation of the second law. It doesn't actually defy it.
So how does it work then?
Living organisms contribute to the overall entropy of the universe. They achieve their internal order by actively seeking out and capturing free energy from their environment. Sunlight, chemical bonds, the energy in other organisms.
Mm-hmm.
They use that energy to do the work of staying alive, growing, reproducing. And in doing that, they inevitably generate heat and waste, which adds to the total disorder, the total entropy in the universe.
Okay, so they create order inside, but increase disorder outside.
Precisely. And he also noted a fundamental principle. The bigger and more complex an organism is, the more work it needs to do, the more energy it needs to capture, just to stay alive, maintain its structure, reproduce.
Makes sense.
So viewed through this lens, the long, sprawling history of life on Earth can be described as this continuous, increasingly sophisticated ability to capture energy from new and more abundant sources.
Like what?
Well, it started simple, maybe geothermal reactions, then the massive power of sunlight through photosynthesis, then the even greater efficiency offered by oxygen, and finally, the energy locked up in the flesh of other living organisms. Right. Each of these energy revolutions led to the evolution of increasingly complex, energy-hungry, and, in this purely physical sense, harder-working life forms.
And there's a key molecule involved.
Yes, ATP, adenosine triphosphate. It's highlighted as the universal energy currency for all cells, from single-celled bacteria right up to us. Early life, those ancient bacteria, had to cope with incredibly hostile, oxygen-poor conditions, just scraping energy from geochemical reactions.
That's life.
Very. Then the emergence of oxygen, itself a byproduct of early life, it vastly expanded the available energy for life to work with. That allowed for the evolution of more complex eukaryotes, and eventually the incredible diversity of multicellular life we see today.
Okay, so if all life, from a bacterium to a blue whale, does work in this thermodynamic sense, what about intentional, purposeful work? The kind that involved decision-making, conscious effort.
Right, moving beyond just staying alive.
The book gives some really fascinating animal examples here that make you rethink our sort of human-centric view of purpose.
As Coco.
Exactly. Coco the gorilla. Famously fluent in gorilla sign language, understood around 2,000 English words, which is amazing.
Incredible.
Yet apparently she sometimes struggled with grammar, which could confuse and frustrate her. Her trainers were absolutely convinced she was emotionally sophisticated. They believed she wanted to communicate, that she laughed at jokes, cried, could express complex feelings like happy or love.
They saw real intent.
They did. But then you had the skeptics, quite reasonably, calling her a highly competent mimic, suggesting her signing was primarily a way to get rewards, like tickles and treats.
The classic debate about animal consciousness. And this intriguing case leads us to a really crucial distinction the book elaborates on. Purposeful behavior versus purposive behavior.
Okay, what's the difference?
Purposeful behavior is when the agent, the individual doing the action, understands and can, in theory, describe their own intent, like Coco's trainers believing she wanted to communicate complex thoughts, or a human chef purposefully baking a cake for a party, knowing the steps and the desired outcome.
Got it. Intentional.
Right. Purposive behavior, on the other hand, is when an external observer attributes purpose, but the agent itself doesn't necessarily understand or describe that purpose internally.
Like a plant growing towards the sun.
Exactly. Like a sunflower naturally turning towards the sun, we attribute the purpose of photosynthesis and survival, but the plant isn't consciously thinking, I need more sun. Or moths fatally flying into a flame, a behavior with a tragic external purpose that the moth doesn't comprehend.
Okay.
So when lions hunt a wildebeest, while it's instinct-driven, their strategic coordination and decision-making during the hunt show a higher degree of purposeful, intentional action than, say, the unconscious, purposive work of bacteria breaking down food in our gut.
And then there's this absolutely intriguing anecdote about the masked weavers, a type of bird.
Ah, the weavers. Yeah, this is a great story.
Male masked weavers are incredibly diligent builders. They construct around 25 elaborate, sturdy nests each breeding season, designed to protect eggs and offspring.
Hard workers.
Definitely. But despite their impressive craftsmanship, the females often choose mates based mainly on the nest's location, not necessarily the quality of the construction.
All that work.
Right. And even more perplexing, these males habitually destroy perfectly good nests they've built, not just when a female rejects them, but seemingly at random.
Why would they do that?
Well, folklore suggested poor memory, or maybe rivals destroying them. But a Yuhoan man named Springan offered this profound, almost poetic speculation.
What did he think?
He observed his own wife, who found immense pride, joy, and peace in the skill and artistry of making beautiful beaded objects. She'd even unpick old ones to reuse the beads if she ran out of new materials. Spriana speculated the weavers were, like my wife, finding intrinsic value, maybe even a kind of meditative pleasure, in the act of creation itself, in the artistry, beyond pure utility. He saw it as a virtue.
This anecdote raises a really important question challenging our preconceived notions of work, doesn't it?
It really does.
Is the weaver's seemingly pointless behavior purely utilitarian, as many evolutionary biologists might argue? You know, maybe signaling fitness to mates by showing surplus energy or just staying in condition through constant building?
What?
Or is there an element of inherent drive, a work for work's sake, a kind of pointless work that deeply echoes human hobbies or art or other seemingly non-utilitarian pursuits? The book points out that other species, like birds of paradise with their incredibly elaborate, energy-expensive plumage displays, and bowerbirds with their non-functional, highly decorated nests and courtship arenas, they also engage in what the author calls expensive elaboration that isn't strictly utilitarian for survival.
Defies simple explanation.
It does. These traits defy a purely energy quest or survival of the fittest explanation. The discussion also touches upon eusociality, this rare form of social organization found in termites, ants, some mole rats.
Or individual sacrifice for the group.
Exactly. Where individuals perform highly specialized jobs and even self-sacrifice for the colony's well-being. Think termite workers dedicating their lives to building complex structures, climate control, feeding others, managing fungus farms.
Wow.
Soldiers heroically sacrificing themselves. Even the kings and queens are kind of slaves to their specialized roles, just focused on reproduction. This apparent altruism, rooted in the Greek eu, meaning good, is astonishingly rare. Outside insects, it's only found in snapping shrimp and 2 species of mole rat.
So bring this back to you, the listener. Does work only have meaning if it's strictly utilitarian, serving a practical survival purpose? Or is there, as the Weaver anecdote suggests, an intrinsic value in the very act of making, of creating, of engaging with a task for its own sake, maybe even for animals?
It really challenges our anthropocentric view, suggesting maybe that drive to create, or just do, goes deeper than we usually imagine.
Okay, so if animals perform work in this broader sense, from thermodynamics to purposeful creation, how did humans develop the concept of work as we understand it? That distinct idea of a directed, effortful activity, often separate from leisure.
Yeah, where did the word come from even?
Well, historically, mathematicians and engineers before Gaspard Gustave Coriolis back in 1829 used various terms like dynamical effect or laboring force for what we now call work in physics.
Right.
But it was Coriolis and his calculations on the effect of machines who found that perfect, concise word, work. Interestingly, though, the French word for work, travail, carries this much deeper, almost poetic resonance that's often lost in the English translation.
What does it imply?
It connotes not just effort or exertion, but a sense of suffering, of tribulation. It evokes the arduous realities faced by France's lower classes, toiling under the aristocracy. So that linguistic root hints at a much older, darker association with labor. And what's truly fascinating is how universal mythologies, across completely different cultures, share this profound common thread. You see it in the Jew hoansi's 2-phase creation story, and you see it in the familiar Christian Adam and Eve narrative.
What's the common thread?
In the Jew hoansi cosmology, their creator God initially leaves the world in this state of chaotic ambiguity. It's only when he returns that order gets imposed, often after a trickster god, Gawa, has sown chaos and introduced the very ambiguities that humans then have to strive to manage.
Ah, the trickster figure.
Exactly. They even drew parallels, seeing their trickster Gawa in the Adamic serpent that tempted Adam and Eve, leading to their banishment from paradise to toil in the fields.
So work becomes necessary to maintain order.
Precisely. This banishment, the resulting labor, was understood as the necessary effort to keep these chaotic forces in check, to maintain the world's fragile order. And this theme resonates in so many global mythologies. You've got trickster figures like Loki in Norse lore, Coyote in Native American traditions, Raven in indigenous Pacific Northwest stories, Anansi the spider in West African tales.
They all stir things up.
They do. They're often depicted as the very entities who, through their mischief, inadvertently create the need for humans to work, to strive, to organize the world right from the beginning of time.
So this pervasive mythological thread suggests that work, as a distinct concept separate from just physical activity, is deeply tied to our human interpretation of the world's inherent order, or maybe its lack of order, and our perceived role in maintaining it.
Our place in the cosmos, almost.
Kind of. And French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, the structuralist guy, emphasized how human cultures inherently think in these binary opposites.
Good, bad, dark, light, raw, cooked, and crucially, work rest.
Right, those pairings. He famously argued that mastering cooking marked humanity's fundamental transition from nature to culture, defining the human state. And this is a core idea the book really amplifies. By giving our ancestors more leisure time, because of fire reducing the food quest effort fires simultaneously and, almost paradoxically, breathed life into leisure's conceptual opposite, work.
Defining one created the other.
Exactly. This conceptualization, this separation of activities into work and leisure, then set humanity on this seemingly inexorable path, from nomadic foraging in wild landscapes all the way to the regimented factory floor of the industrial age. The very idea of freedom from labor implicitly created the idea of labor itself.
Okay, so with these developing conceptual frameworks, what exactly did early humans do with their hands and brains? Let's talk tools, because that's where we see the physical evidence of early human work.
Yeah, the tangible stuff.
The book gives us this fascinating contrast. You've got the Oldowan tools, dating back maybe 2.6 million years. And these are, well, to be optimistic, basically just rocks that have been bashed or flaked in a pretty rudimentary way. Simple, crude, but effective.
The earliest toolkit.
Right. Compare those to the Acheulean hand axes, which show up much later, around 1.6 million years ago. These aren't just flaked rocks. They're distinctly pear-shaped, remarkably symmetrical.
Oh, sophisticated.
Yay more. They required a far more complex, multi-stage process. You have to imagine finding the right kind of stone, carefully hammering off a workable core, then progressively smoothing and shaping it with different hammerstones, controlling the flakes precisely.
Takes skill.
Immense dexterity, and apparently a high failure rate in making them. Yet, despite that difficulty, they represent the most enduring tool design in human history, staying largely unchanged for over 1.5 million years.
Incredible longevity.
It is. And it was Homo erectus that was the first hominin species known to consistently make these sophisticated Acheulean tools. Homo habilis is associated more with the earlier, simpler Oldowan stuff.
But what's truly intriguing here, and easy to forget, is that while stone tools are incredibly durable, they fossilize well, they stick around.
Right? We find them.
The vast majority of tools used by early foragers were almost certainly organic, made from wood, leather, bone, things that just don't last.
You decompose.
Exactly. So there's this much richer, essentially invisible archaeology of daily life that we can only really speculate about. The ubiquitous digging stick used by the hoansi, just made from a thick, straight hardwood branch, is a great example.
What was it used for?
So many things. Essential for digging up nutritious roots and tubers, served as a walking stick on long treks, used for clearing thorny paths, even as a crucial weapon for defense or hunting.
Multi-tool.
Totally. And its absence from most archaeological sites doesn't mean it wasn't historically important. It just highlights the limits of our preserved evidence.
And the book really drives home the point that mastering any complex skill, whether it's making these Acheulean tools or, say, persistence hunting in Eland of the Kalahari, which involves incredibly subtle tracking and amazing endurance.
Yeah, that takes serious know-how.
It takes immense time, sustained energy, significant work. It's not innate. It involves this continuous process of learning through direct instruction, careful imitation of elders, years of dedicated practice, until the skill becomes second nature.
Like muscle memory.
Exactly, like a concert pianist playing effortlessly or a skilled athlete controlling a ball instinctively. It demands fine dexterity, considerable cognitive processing power, sheer perseverance, a strong desire to learn, and even imagination to visualize the end result.
And this leads to a really crucial insight about us, about Homo sapiens. Brain size relative to body size, and particularly the development of the neocortex, that outer layer associated with higher order functions, correlates profoundly with intelligence and our unique capacity to acquire skills.
Our big brains.
Our big brains. Human newborns are almost comically helpless compared to, say, a foal that can walk within hours.
Yep.
But that helplessness is the trade-off for this astonishing period of frenzied brain development after birth. Our infant brains build twice as many synapses or neural connections as they'll eventually keep by early adolescence.
Well, pruning them back later.
Right. And this neurological plasticity, this incredible adaptability of our young brains, is what allows us to be so uniquely skilled at acquiring skills. It's what lets us adapt and exploit diverse environments all over the globe, unlike most animals with highly specialized, genetically hardwired capabilities.
We're generalists who learn.
We are, and what's often overlooked is that this process of brain molding, this capacity for learning, continues into adulthood, just maybe at a slower pace. But ironically, this very characteristic, our amazing plasticity when young and its gradual decline as we age, also accounts for why, as we get older, many of us become more stubbornly resistant to change, both personally and societally. Our neural pathways get a bit entrenched.
Okay, so if mastering tools was one energy revolution, here's a truly monumental turning point. The mastery of fire.
Ah, fire. Yes.
The book rightly calls it fire's other gifts because its impact went way beyond just warmth and light. For the hoansi, fire is revered as the great transformer.
How so?
They see it as this divine gift, maybe generated by gods through lightning, but crucially, it can be made by anyone with just 2 dry sticks and enough patience. It transforms raw food into cooked food, cold bodies into warm ones, darkness into light. It offers essential protection from predators.
Practical uses.
Very, but also more. It became a tool for sophisticated land management through controlled burning, which ushered in new life and growth. And hoansi shamans even harness fire's intense energy to transport them to the spirit world during healing trance dances. It has deep spiritual significance.
And if fire could transport them to the spirit world, think about what it did for our ancestors in a practical sense. Its mastery profoundly reduced the time and effort they had to dedicate purely to the food quest.
How did that work?
Well, go back maybe 2 million years. Early hominins like Australopithecus were mainly eating raw plants. Then around 1.5 million years ago, Homo habilis started adding more complex organisms, becoming more omnivorous.
Okay.
But it was the consistent, systematic mastery of fire and the ability to cook that really kicked off what the book calls the second and arguably the greatest energy revolution in human history.
Why was cooking so revolutionary?
Think about it. Trying to build and maintain our remarkably large, energy-guzzling brains on a diet of raw, fibrous plants. Virtually impossible. Cooking meat, especially fattier cuts and organ meats and previously indigestible plants like tubers, it vastly increased the nutritional return for way less chewing and digestive effort.
Pre-digesting the food, essentially.
Exactly. The oldest reliable evidence for systematic fire use is about 1 million years old, from Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, likely Homo erectus. Now, definitive proof for widespread controlled fire is often tricky. Archaeologically, ash disperses. Many early hominins lived on savannas, not just in caves. But that period of sustained, rapid brain growth, starting around 2 million years ago, something Richard Wrangham has really championed strongly, suggests controlled fire use was a critical factor. It just makes evolutionary sense. Our physiology even changed: smaller jaws, smaller guts compared to other primates.
Okay, so with more energy from cooked food and significantly less time spent just chasing down calories, Homo erectus gained something incredibly valuable: free time. Leisure, gift of time. Right. Now, the archaeological record from this period is admittedly pretty sparse, lots of speculation. But the book powerfully argues that this leisure time became a surprisingly potent evolutionary pressure.
How so? Boredom.
Exactly. Boredom, which we often see negatively today, is highlighted here, maybe surprisingly, as a fertile mother of invention. It actively drove human curiosity, encouraged risk-taking. It might well have been boredom that led our ancestors to experiment, banging rocks together to get sharp flakes, or persistently rubbing sticks together to make fire, just messing around.
Filling the time.
And more than that, this newfound leisure time very likely honed and refined crucial problem-solving skills, and, perhaps most importantly, communication skills. This leads to this really tantalizing prospect that, evolutionarily speaking, we might be as much a product of our leisure as we are of our labor. What we do when we're not working profoundly shaped who we became.
And this brings us right to that critical, fascinating question about the emergence of human language.
Yeah, where did that come from?
Well, the physical changes from eating cooked food, softer mouths, more flexible throats, repositioned larynxes, that gave us the necessary hardware for complex sounds.
Okay, the vocal equipment.
Right. But language, as we know it, requires incredibly complex cognitive processing. Robin Dunbar's influential gossip and grooming hypothesis offers a compelling explanation.
What's the hypothesis?
He suggests language evolved partly from the affectionate social grooming you see in primates. As hominid groups got larger, physical grooming just became impractical for maintaining social bonds across the whole group.
Takes too long.
Exactly. So vocal grooming emerged using vocalizations to soothe and bond with multiple individuals at a distance, and, crucially, it allowed for gossip.
Gossip. Really?
Yeah, sharing information about who's reliable, who's cheating, who's a good potential mate, essential social information. The inherent human need to occupy restless minds during this newfound free time likely put strong evolutionary pressure on communication skills.
Survival of the chattiest.
Kinda. It's selected for individuals who are socially adept, articulate, imaginative, verbally astute, those who could use language effectively, to tell captivating stories, entertain peers, charm potential mates, skillfully seduce, seduction being a key part of positive sexual selection. So language, in this view, might have been born partly out of the need to fill the void created by leisure.
This whole evolutionary journey brings us to a crucial conceptual leap, the emergence of the concept of work itself as something distinct from just doing stuff.
Right, the idea of it.
The book points to evidence like intentional, ritualized burial practices. For example, those associated with Homo naledi maybe 236,000 to 335,000 years ago. These complex rituals suggest these hominins had a pretty sophisticated conceptual apparatus.
Meaning they could think abstractly.
It implies they had the mental capacity not just to act, but to categorize and divide their world, including, potentially, the ability to distinguish between different types of activities, maybe even labeling some as work and others as leisure.
Even back then.
The evidence suggests the capacity was there. Such conceptualization strongly implies culture and language, even in rudimentary forms, long before we think of fully modern humans.
And if we connect this back to Levi-Strauss and structuralism?
The binary opposites.
Exactly. His emphasis on how cultures think in pairs, good, bad, dark, light, raw, cooked, and now workist becomes even more profound. He famously argued that cooking wasn't just tech, it marked the transition from nature to culture.
Defining us as human.
Right. And the core idea here, which Suzman really elaborates on beautifully, is that by giving our ancestors more leisure time through fire, this revolutionary gift simultaneously and somewhat ironically breathes life into leisure's conceptual opposite, work.
By creating leisure, you create work.
Precisely. The act of defining leisure automatically created its counterpart, work. And this set humanity on that seemingly inevitable path, from foraging in the forest to the factory floor. The very idea of freedom from labor implicitly created the idea of labor itself.
Okay, remember how earlier we talked about hunter-gatherer societies maybe not seeing scarcity as this inherent, inescapable part of life?
Yeah, the hoansi example.
This is where that really comes into sharp focus and challenges some of our deeply held modern beliefs. Richard Borselley's groundbreaking study of the hoansi back in the 1960s, and this was during a severe drought in Botswana, so conditions were already tough.
Not exactly easy living.
No. It revealed something astonishing to Western researchers. He found they acquired all their food with what he called modest effort, working only about 17 hours per week on the direct food quest.
17 hours. That's it.
That's it for getting food. And maybe another 20 hours a week on other essential chores, preparing food, making tools, maintaining camp, that sort of thing.
Still less than a standard work week today.
Way less. Less than half the time typically spent by employed Americans back then. And crucially, in their communal society, kids and the elderly were fully supported. They weren't seen as burdens. They were part of the social fabric.
And this eye-opening study led the anthropologist Marshall Sahlins to famously coin that term, the original affluent society.
Right. What did you mean by that?
Sahlins provocatively argued that hunter-gatherers' affluence didn't come from producing a massive surplus like how we define wealth today, but rather from desiring little. They weren't burdened by these nagging desires beyond their immediate needs. It's a stark contrast to, say, a modern Wall Street banker who, despite having tons of stuff, might be constantly striving for more, always chasing the next thing.
So affluence through wanting less, not having more.
Exactly. And this profoundly suggests that scarcity wasn't the fundamental economic problem for the vast majority of human history. Foragers, by and large, were present-focused. They weren't overly concerned with abstract future planning, like saving for retirement or meticulously tracking genealogies back generations.
It's in the now.
Pretty much. They had few wants, and those wants were generally easily satisfied by what nature provided: fruits, game, water. Their whole economic system was governed by this principle called demand sharing.
Demand sharing.
Yeah, where it was considered incredibly rude, even offensive, to refuse a request for something if you had it. The amount given away wasn't fixed. It was determined by how much you had relative to others. It ensured equitable distribution.
Sounds fair.
It was a powerful social mechanism. Interestingly, it kind of fulfilled Adam Smith's ideal of equitable distribution, but in a small-scale communal context, driven by what Suzman calls envy-fueled demand sharing. It wasn't pure altruism. It was about preventing anyone from accumulating too much power or stuff.
Keeping egos in check.
Definitely. Hunters, for instance, never expected praise for a big kill. Instead, they were traditionally mocked, told to cool his heart and make him gentle, specifically to stop them from becoming chiefs or big men and gaining too much social capital.
Wow. Humility enforced by teasing.
Right. And gift-giving, for things like jewelry or clothes, was a separate system, but it also emphasized circulation. Gifts were meant to be re-gifted, flowing through the community, not hoarded.
Imagine that for a moment. A society where your wealth, your status, isn't measured by what you accumulate, but by what you give away.
Totally different mindset.
How radically would that change our motivations for work, for striving, for consumption? It's a truly profound thought experiment. But this picture, maybe idyllic, or at least less scarcity-driven, it changes dramatically with the advent of agriculture.
Yeah, the big shift.
Vere Gordon Childe, the Marxist archaeologist who believed in big societal transformations driven by economics, he famously called it the Neolithic Revolution.
A revolution, yeah.
This huge shift began around 12,000 years ago. Childe argued it was this truly profound turning point, altering how people lived, thought, worked, and fundamentally, how they captured and stored energy. It also led to unprecedented, rapid human population growth, setting the stage for everything that followed.
Now, if we connect this to the broader archaeological understanding today, it's worth noting that while Childe saw it as a sudden revolution, we now understand it was a much more gradual, kind of mutualistic process.
Not overnight.
No. Some plants, like wild wheat and barley, almost invited domestication. They were naturally high-yielding, self-pollinating, relatively easy to cultivate. And there's fascinating evidence suggesting that some European and Asian foragers, like those from Sungir in Russia, way back 30,000 to 34,000 years ago.
That's long before agriculture.
Exactly. They had already started storing food, accommodating seasonal variations. This indicates a much longer-term, evolving relationship with both work and the concept of future scarcity, long before full-scale farming took hold.
Seeds were planted early, conceptually.
Kind of. And similarly, sites like Blombos Cave in South Africa, dating back an astonishing 100,000 years, show early Homo sapiens were already self-aware, capable of complex, purposeful behavior, making sophisticated tools, shell necklaces, even sleeping on herb mattresses, demonstrating a degree of behavioral modernity long before we used to think it emerged. So the groundwork for agriculture, both practically and mentally, was laid over millennia.
But despite its revolutionary implications, farming wasn't some easy upgrade to a better life. It came with immense, often unforeseen challenges that actually made life significantly tougher in many ways.
The downsides of farming.
Yeah, early agricultural populations, paradoxically, often lived harder, more precarious lives than their hunter-gatherer ancestors. They faced relentless environmental risks, unpredictable droughts, devastating floods, untimely frosts that could just wipe out a whole harvest overnight.
Dangerous gamble.
Totally. Pests like locusts and rodents, pathogens like fungi and bacteria, they frequently devastated precious crops and herds. The very act of domestication inadvertently sped up the evolution of these pathogens, parasites, and weeds, creating new biological enemies.
Unintended consequences.
Big time. Like some weeds adapted incredible resilience, making farmers' work even more strenuous. And livestock, while providing food and labor, introduced a new major threat: zoonotic diseases.
Diseases from animals.
Right? These diseases, transferable from animals to humans, account for nearly 60% of all human diseases today, and a scary 75% of all emerging infectious diseases. Plus, soil depletion was this constant nagging problem, forcing early farmers to either migrate to new lands or try rudimentary crop cycling, often without much success. Widespread knowledge of efficient crop rotation, like the Norfolk four-core system, wouldn't be common for millennia.
And this brings us to a stark, often overlooked reality found in the bones. Archaeological evidence like stress fractures and the thickening of work-worn bones in early farming populations confirms that death by overwork has been a grim reality pretty much since farming began.
Literally worked to death.
The physical toll was immense, and early farmers, faced with exhausted land, frequently chose expansion moving into new territory rather than trying to innovate with intensive farming techniques in one place. This constant search for new, fertile ground was a major driver in agriculture's rapid and relentless spread across continents, transforming landscapes and human societies along the way.
Okay, one of the most profound, maybe subtle legacies of farming beyond just diet or where people lived was the complete transformation of our understanding of time itself.
How we perceive time.
Exactly. Foragers, as we discussed, were profoundly present-focused. They hunted when hungry, gathered when stuff was ripe, moved when local resources ran low. They had few material wants, no big ambitions for future wealth, and saw no real difference between their lives and their ancestors' lives.
Cyclical view.
Right. Change was imminent, always happening, but within predictable natural ranges. They didn't meticulously calculate genealogies back generations or dwell on past catastrophes. Carrying the weight of history, for nomads, was as impractical as carrying a house. Their worldview was tied to seasons, the immediate environment.
But connect that to farming. Food production utterly forced humanity into a past, present, future mindset. Farmers had to think ahead.
Planning became essential.
Absolutely. You had to clear land now, sow seeds in the right season, nurture crops for future harvest months, even a year away. You had to manage future risks based on past experience, remembering last year's flood, or the best time to plant that specific crop.
Learning from history.
Yes. And huge undertakings like building Stonehenge in Britain, dating mainly to around 2300 BCE, though parts are even older.
Required long-term vision.
Exactly. Such projects illustrate this multi-generational view of work. They needed planning and effort spanning decades, maybe centuries. Breeding livestock, too, demanded thinking months, sometimes years ahead for successful offspring. A cow needs 40 weeks gestation. This entirely new relationship with linear time, this future-oriented, planning-intensive existence, it fundamentally shaped every aspect of their lives, from spiritual beliefs to social structures.
And this brings us to another huge revolutionary shift that came directly from that agricultural surplus, the rise of cities.
Urbanization begins.
Ancient cities could only emerge once farmers got productive enough to generate consistent grand energy surpluses, meaning they grew way more food than they needed themselves, enough to sustain large populations of people who didn't farm.
Specialists emerge.
Right. Look at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dating to the 10th millennium BCE, the oldest known monumental architecture anywhere. Its sheer scale and complexity strongly suggest its construction involved a complex division of labor, specialized jobs not tied directly to food production.
What kind of jobs?
We're talking potentially full-time specialists, masons, artists, carvers, designers, organizers. Later, early Mesopotamian city-states like Uruk around 3000 BCE were among the first to develop rudimentary forms of money. They used inscribed clay ledgers for accounting and even paid laborers in beer.
Paid in bear. Nice.
There's a 5,000-year-old clay tablet from Uruk, often cited as one of the world's first payslips, detailing beer rations for workers. It signals a real formalization of work and compensation.
What's particularly striking here, though, is the shift in how value is determined. While classical European philosophy, figures like Thomas Aquinas even, acknowledged work's importance and believed value should reflect the labor involved.
Labor theory of value, sort of.
Kind of. But in these new urban centers, value was increasingly set not by the effort of labor, but by price, by market forces. Adam Smith, much later optimistically believed self-interest, guided by that invisible hand, could lead to equitable distribution.
Did it work?
Well, the book argues that ideal worked best in those small-scale communal societies like the hoansi, where that envy-fueled demand sharing naturally ensured fairness. In larger, complex urban economies, the direct link between labor effort and reward got much fuzzier, leading to early forms of economic disparity.
And within these burgeoning cities, a huge array of new professions flourished, each gaining its own social importance. Ancient Rome, for instance, a massive metropolis, boasted something like 268 different recorded career paths.
Wow, that many.
Yeah, everything from powerful bureaucrats and skilled lawyers down to humble barbers and, gladiators. And this specialization wasn't always centrally planned. It often arose organically.
Oh.
City dwellers just naturally found companionship, comfort, shared identity among others doing similar work, having similar experiences. This led to neighborhoods becoming associated with specific trades echoes we still see today, like Harley Street in London for doctors, Hatton Garden for jewelers. This merging of social identity with your trade became a defining feature of urban life.
And this evolution of specialized work brings up an important point about cooperation, something often overlooked in our modern competitive narratives.
Right.
The Roman artisan colleges, or collegia.
What were they? Guilds?
Sort of, but more. They functioned almost like autonomous villages within the city. They provided a vital sense of community, a clear civic identity, and crucially, protection against the competition from cheap slave labor, which was everywhere. Some even had their own private militias.
Protection and community.
Exactly. It shows that for much of history, people in similar trades naturally cooperated, formed strong bonds, collective identities. It really challenges that modern kill-or-be-killed competition story we often tell about markets. These collegia fostered deep bonds based on shared skills, experiences, social status.
And that connection between work and identity is still strong.
Hugely strong. Most of us spend a vast amount of our waking lives with colleagues. Our work often becomes a primary social hub, profoundly shaping our ambitions, values, even political views. The book even cites a fascinating statistic. Nearly 1 in 3 Americans enters at least one long-term relationship with someone they meet through work, and 16% meet their future spouse there.
Wow.
It really underscores how deeply work has woven itself into our social fabric, defining who we are and who we connect with.
So think about it for yourself. How much of your personal identity, your social circle, even your closest relationships are defined by the work you do or the profession you belong to? It's a subtle but powerful connection with really ancient roots. Okay, as we move into the Industrial Revolution, that specter of machines replacing human labor looms larger than ever. It's a fear with deep historical roots.
Yeah, it's not new.
Mary Shelley's groundbreaking novel, Frankenstein, published way back in 1818, is often read not just as Gothic horror, but as this powerful parable about the dangers of unchecked progress and disruptive technologies, much like our anxieties about AI today.
The monster we create.
Exactly. And this fear wasn't just literary. It was embodied by the Luddites in early 19th century England. These were groups of desperate textile workers who, between 1811 and 1816, literally raged against the machines smashing steam engines, automated looms that directly threatened their livelihoods. The Leeds Mercury newspaper at the time chillingly reported their regions were in an insurrectional state. Real upheaval.
And what's truly illuminating here is the deeper history of how humans started viewing animals as machines, which kind of paved the way for seeing human labor similarly.
How so?
René Descartes, the influential 17th century philosopher, famously viewed animals as complex biological automata, essentially unthinking, unfeeling machines.
Animals as robots.
Pretty much. This was a stark contrast to that holistic worldview of hunter-gatherers, who often believed animals had souls, a life force, maybe even gifted themselves for food in a spiritual contract.
Right.
This Cartesian dehumanization of animals, reducing them to mechanisms, made it psychologically easier for butchers, farmers, later industrialists, to deny empathy and exploit livestock for labor and meat without moral qualms.
Made it easier to use them.
Yes. Yet, the relationship isn't always purely utilitarian. The discovery of the Oberkassel puppy in Germany, dating back 14,700 years, shows dogs were domesticated way earlier than other creatures, often primarily for work like hunting and guarding. This ancient bond fostered remarkable mutual loyalty, even love, between humans and dogs, transcending just utility.
Man's best friend.
Right. And today, our footprint is immense. Humans and our domestic animals make up a staggering 96% of all mammalian biomass on Earth. Humans alone are about 36%.
Wow, 96%.
It's a colossal increase from pre-agricultural times, showing our unprecedented capacity to control and reshape the living world for our purposes, often through their work.
And the concept of humans themselves as working machines has an even darker, more brutal history.
Slavery.
Slavery. In ancient Greek city-states like Athens, which championed democracy for citizens, slaves formed the very backbone of the economy. They did backbreaking manual labor, but also highly cerebral work. Skilled lawyers, accountants, bureaucrats.
Slaves did intellectual work too.
Absolutely. Aristotle, one of history's most revered thinkers, infamously defended slavery, believing slaves existed precisely so that thinkers like him could have the leisure for philosophy and civic life.
That's uncomfortable to hear now.
Deeply. In Rome, where slaves were a massive chunk of the population, maybe 25% to 33%, they were literally listed alongside livestock in farm inventories. They did almost every job imaginable. Mining, construction, teaching, medicine. Military service was one of the few exceptions. Some slaves, the servus publicus, were even owned by the city itself.
And this historical reliance on intelligent working machines, the slaves in the Roman economy, it faced striking parallels to the economic challenges we see with large-scale automation today, especially around wealth inequality.
How so?
While slaves generated immense wealth for the patrician class, their unpaid labor significantly disadvantaged poorer Roman citizens. Free citizens had to compete for scarce jobs, often getting pushed into poverty.
Sound familiar?
Very. Those artisan collegia we mentioned formed partly to protect free labor, offering community and a buffer against slave labor competition. But ultimately, these efforts couldn't prevent Rome's decline and collapse, a process often accelerated by what the book calls corrosive inequality.
Inequality undermined the system.
It seems so. The energy footprint of people in big Roman cities vastly exceeded provincial farmers, supported by this massive influx of resources and labor, mostly slave labor, which powered everything from aqueducts and roads to colosseums and the lavish lifestyles of the elite. Even the common Roman citizens, the plebeians, were arguably better off than provincial farmers because of this slave-powered system.
So you have to ask yourself, is modern automation just recreating these ancient economic problems, but with algorithms and robots instead of enslaved humans? As we zoom forward to today, the book really zeroes in on the modern urban experience, highlighting its unique, often insidious form of scarcity.
Yeah, the city experience.
The poignant story of Thaddeus Gureb, moving from his rural Namibian village to a sprawling informal settlement outside Windhoek, powerfully illustrates this massive global urbanization trend. Since 2008, more people live in cities than the countryside, a historic first.
A tipping point.
And cities, while undeniably these crucibles of creativity, innovation, power, and diversity, are also places of stark wealth inequality, often brutally visible in the way houses and security systems escalate as you move from shanty towns to affluent areas.
And what's particularly insidious here is how urban ambition gets molded and fueled by a different kind of scarcity. Not absolute scarcity, lack of food or water, but relative scarcity.
Keeping up with the Joneses.
Exactly that, writ large. Scarcity driven by aspiration, by that pervasive feeling of jealousy, by an endless, often manufactured desire for more. The sociologist Emile Durkheim called this the malady of infinite aspiration.
Malady of infinite aspiration. Strong phrase.
It is. A state where there are no limits to men's aspirations, and people no longer know what is possible and what is unjust. He linked this feeling of anomie, normlessness, social dislocation to profound societal problems, even suicide, especially for craftsmen whose skills became obsolete in a changing economy, leading to a loss of purpose and status. This relative scarcity is a powerful engine of modern work, constantly pushing us to acquire more, not out of need, but out of a desire to keep up or get ahead.
The Industrial Revolution didn't just bring machines, it brought a new kind of religion. Efficiency. Epitomized by the controversial figure of Frederick Winslow Taylor.
Taylorism.
Taylor, often called the father of the efficiency movement, genuinely believed time is money. He applied this almost scientific rigor to manual labor, using a stopwatch to micro-optimize every task, stripping away any movement he saw as wasteful.
Treating people like machines.
Pretty much. His goal was to find the right person for the right job, which often meant, in his view, someone with limited imagination, boundless patience, and a willingness to obediently do the same repetitive tasks in a factory redesigned for maximum output.
Samuel Gompers, the powerful head of the American Federation of Labor back then, was a huge critic. He argued Taylorism fundamentally robbed workers of meaning and dignity, transforming them into high-speed automatic machines, just a cog or a nut in the industrial mechanism.
Dehumanizing.
Absolutely. And despite these truly exponential rises in productivity, which theoretically should have meant much less working hours, have remained stubbornly stuck around that traditional 40 hours per week for most people, profoundly defying Keynes' optimistic 15-hour prediction.
Why didn't hours decrease?
Well, the book touches on figures like John Lubbock, nicknamed Saint Lubbock for pushing for bank holidays in Britain in the 1870s, emphasizing rest. But it's a telling detail that Lubbock himself lived a life of immense privilege.
He had leisure.
He did. Wealthy enough to pursue eccentric hobbies, like famously teaching his poodle to read, a stark contrast to the grim reality of factory labor faced by the workers he advocated for. His ability to champion leisure for others was possible precisely because he didn't have to work those grinding hours, highlighting the deep class divide in the very concept of leisure.
So it begs the question, if we're so incredibly productive, if tech gives us such immense capacity, why do we still work so much? Maybe it's not about what we need to work for, but what we choose to work for.
The consumer society angle.
Exactly. Post-World War II, America saw this profound consumer revolution. Take Will Kellogg, the cereal guy. During the Great Depression, he famously cut factory hours at Kellogg's to just 30 per week, an innovative move to share work and create jobs.
Progressive for the time.
Very. But by the 1950s, after the war, prosperity returning. 3/4 of Kellogg's factory staff actually voted to go back to the 40-hour week.
Why? More leisure sounds good.
Their motivation, more money. To buy more of the constantly upgraded consumer products flooding the market, enticing them with new desires.
John Kenneth Galbraith, in his hugely influential 1958 book, The Affluent Society, argued powerfully that material scarcity in advanced economies was largely solved. We had enough stuff. But, he observed, America was squandering its immense wealth on manufactured desires, once actively created and perpetuated by a burgeoning advertising industry. He famously pointed to campaigns like De Beers' A Diamond is Forever.
Ah, the Diamond Campaign.
Right. It almost single-handedly created the enduring link between eternal love and diamonds, manufacturing huge demand where very little existed before 1940. Galbraith argued corporations weren't just meeting needs, they were actively manipulating aspirations, exploiting anxieties about social status, subtly convincing people they needed more, making them strive for relative needs, wanting what others had, wanting to display status rather than fundamental absolute needs like food and shelter. This relentless manufacturing of desire keeps that consumer treadmill spinning and keeps us working harder to stay on it.
And this brings us to a really crucial economic shift that makes many of these issues worse. What's often called the Great Decoupling.
What decoupled?
For much of the 20th century, productivity gains, how much output an hour of work produced, largely tracked wage growth for the average worker. As the economy got more productive, workers got paid more.
Made sense. Share the gains.
Right. But crucially, after about 1980, this relationship broke down dramatically. Productivity, overall economic output, GDP, they all continued to grow robustly. But real median incomes for the vast majority of workers, they stagnated or saw only tiny increases. Meanwhile, executive pay surged to absolutely unprecedented levels.
So the gains went mostly to the top?
Exactly. This resulted in profound, accelerating material inequality. The wealthiest 1% globally captured twice as much new wealth as the remaining 99%. Today, that top 1% owns an astonishing 45% of all global assets.
The book points a finger partly at the McKinsey & Company report, The War for Talent from 1998, as a significant driver of this executive pay inflation.
What did it argue?
It argued, based on what critics later said was a flawed demographic prediction, that the pool of prime talent aged 35-44 would shrink, that companies needed to pay top executives exorbitant sums to win this war for talent.
And did it work? Or was it flawed?
Critics like Jeffrey Pfeffer at Stanford and Malcolm Gladwell, in a sharp critique, famously called the report nonsense. Gladwell even linked its philosophy to Enron's toxic, hyper-competitive culture.
Ouch.
Yeah. Despite this, the illusion of meritocracy persists powerfully. Many people genuinely believe wealth is mainly a direct reflection of hard work and talent. But this belief often prevents acknowledging a systemic reality where owning assets rather than diligent labor has become a far more efficient way to generate immense wealth.
Yeah.
The system seems increasingly stacked against labor, favoring capital.
And the consequences of this modern work paradigm, especially when pushed to extremes, are severe, even deadly. Karoshi, exactly, translates to death by overwork, often heart attacks or strokes, and karujizatsu, or suicide due to overwork. These are officially recognized phenomena in Japan, with similar tragic occurrences in South Korea and China.
Horrifying.
State broadcaster CCTV reported a staggering 500,000 deaths in China annually linked to overwork, though there's likely underreporting everywhere due to stigma. In contrast, Western societies, maybe because of our ingrained work ethic, often attribute these deaths to individual failings or pre-existing conditions rather than acknowledging systemic pressures.
Blaming the victim sometimes.
Seems like it. And what's equally interesting, on the flip side, is the harm of underwork. The case of Ben Aronson in 1977, a civil servant who got physically and mentally ill from being denied meaningful duties.
Boredom making him sick.
Literally. He sued the government for constructive dismissal due to the psychological damage of forced idleness. And, counterintuitively, many lottery winners, despite sudden riches, choose to keep working. It highlights this intrinsic human need for purpose, structure, beyond just money.
This whole spectrum of work-related harm brings us to a really important, almost provocative concept from anthropologist David Graeber: bullshit jobs.
Ah, yes, bullshit jobs. What are
He defined them as employment that is so completely pointless, unnecessary, or pernicious that even the employee cannot justify its existence. Think some corporate lawyers, maybe many PR execs, some academic administrators.
jobs that don't seem to do anything useful?
Exactly, and Graeber's argument is startling. He suggests it's as if someone were out there making up pointless jobs just for the sake of keeping us all working.
Wow, keeping us busy for busyness' sake.
That's the provocative idea. It resonates deeply with Parkinson's law. Work inevitably expands to fill the time available for its completion. It's like a social analogy to life's entropic drive to fill every niche. Bureaucracies especially seem great at generating internal, self-justifying work just to maintain their own existence. Academics, for instance, often report spending way more time on admin than on actual research or teaching.
And circling back to John Maynard Keynes, his 1930 warning about technological unemployment.
Seems more relevant than ever.
It really does. Studies from reputable organizations paint a stark picture. OECD predicts 5% to 40% of jobs are vulnerable to automation. McKinsey suggests 30% to 70%. PwC estimates 21% to 38%. These are huge potential displacements.
And AI is advancing incredibly fast.
Astonishingly, Xiaoyi, an AI, passed a medical exam. AlphaGo beat the world's best Go players. IBM debater held persuasive arguments against human champions. Even in recruitment, Unilever is automating whole functions, saving maybe 70,000 person-hours a year, freeing up human recruiters for more complex stuff.
But what's deeply concerning here and really important to grasp is that this accelerating automation while boosting productivity is also likely to profoundly worsen existing inequality.
How?
It'll likely diminish opportunities for lower-skilled labor while simultaneously inflating incomes for those who own or manage these largely automated businesses. This dynamic directly increases the returns on capital over labor, further benefiting the already wealthy who, as we said, own most global assets.
The rich get richer, the poor get automated out.
That's the fear. This grim trajectory brings us right back to Keynes' utopian vision, where he imagined that the love of money as a possession, that relentless desire for accumulation, would eventually be seen as a disgusting morbidity. He hoped people would naturally value ends above means and prefer the good to the useful.
But that hasn't happened.
Chillingly, no. Instead, as the book details, that malady of infinite aspiration hasn't just persisted, it has colonized our digital ecosystems. Platforms like Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, they amplify desires, constantly pushing us to want more stuff, often things we don't need, which in turn keeps us on that relentless consumer treadmill, working more, not less, to afford it all. #tag conclusion and provocative thought.
Wow, we've traveled through an incredibly deep and frankly mind-bending history of work. From the seemingly effortless abundance and communal sharing of ancient hunter-gatherers living with few material wants,
Simpler times, maybe.
all the way to our complex modern world, filled with infinite aspiration, astonishing technological marvels, and these persistent gnawing anxieties about our place in it all.
What's truly fascinating, though, and maybe gives a glimmer of hope, is that the careful study of contemporary forager societies like the hoansi offers us these invaluable insights. They provide a kind of living, breathing blueprint for a potential future where work doesn't hold the almost sacred, all-consuming place it does now in industrialized societies.
A different model exists.
Exactly. They serve as this powerful reminder that our current attitudes towards work, scarcity, consumption, they aren't inherent human nature.
Yeah.
They're specific products of distinct historical transitions, particularly agriculture and industrialization. Their economic approach, based on desiring little and embracing demand sharing, endured for hundreds of thousands of years, making it arguably the most sustainable and enduring human economic model in history. It really challenges our assumption that our current way is the only way or the inevitable endpoint.
The book, in its concluding thoughts, suggests that to truly escape our current predicament, this endless cycle of striving, manufactured wants, environmental damage, we need to fundamentally abandon our preoccupation with perpetual economic growth as the full measure of success.
Move beyond GDP.
Essentially, it argues we must radically redefine value beyond just market mechanisms. It boldly proposes ideas like universal basic income, shifting taxation away from income towards wealth to address those profound inequalities, and even granting fundamental rights to ecosystems, not just people.
Big ideas.
Huge ideas, all presented as potential pathways to diminish the overwhelming importance we currently give to private wealth accumulation and endless labor.
And if we connect this to the even bigger picture, that malady of infinite aspiration, Durkheim identified.
Right.
Well, as we discussed, it's now colonized and been amplified by our digital world. Social media, constant connectivity, they continually stoke desires, making us want more, paradoxically keeping us on that consumer treadmill, further accelerating environmental impact.
The cycle continues online.
It does. And those dire predictions from the Limits to Growth report back in 1972, initially dismissed, even ridiculed, for suggesting finite resources, they're now being resoundingly reaffirmed by current scientific data. This reality shows that simply slowing economic growth probably isn't enough anymore to avert ecological crises. In many areas, growth urgently needs to be dialed back, moving towards a more circular, less relentlessly growth-dependent model.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? If our species' greatest virtues are incredible productivity, our boundless ambition, our sheer capacity for hard work, are paradoxically pushing us towards environmental collapse, societal burnout, and a world plagued by manufactured wants and deep inequality, how might we as individuals and as collective society begin to redefine success, redefine purpose, redefine the very meaning of a good life in this age of unprecedented human capability and equally unprecedented global challenges? What would it truly take for us to internalize Keynes' profound ideal and genuinely learn to prefer the good to the useful? Thank you so much for tuning in to Daily Review. We truly appreciate you joining us for your daily dose of literary exploration. Your support means the world to us and helps us continue to share these amazing books with you.
It really does. Thanks, everyone.
If you're enjoying what you hear, please consider taking a moment to subscribe, rate, like, and comment on any of the platforms you're listening from.
Yeah, it makes a huge difference.
This really helps support our channel and allows us to get better and bring you even more great content. If today's review sparked your interest and you're ready to dive into a copy of the book, please consider using the link in our description to make your purchase.
Easy way to grab it.
Not only does it make it easy for you to get your hands on the book, but it also directly supports our channel and the author, allowing us to keep bringing you more great content. Thanks again for being a part of the Daily Review community.